Hi, this is Edwin Samuelson. This is the CineFiles. Today we're going to be discussing our favorite books on film.
I would say that my most recent favorite book on the craft of filmmaking is The Conversations, which was basically it was a transcribed conversations between the great editor Walter Murch and Michael Ondaatje, I think is how he pronounces his name, the late Michael Ondaatje, the English patient Michael Ondaatje. And it's just this fascinating book. It's a film school lesson in a book, and it's fascinating. Murch, who's not just a wonderful film editor, but also a wonderful sound editor and one-time director.
Who did Return to Oz.
Return to Oz. And you learn so much about storytelling through film and the craft of editing and how that could change, affect, improve whatever it is that you've shot. And it's just a master class. It's just a wonderful piece of you know, sort of this is how you make film kind of writing. I would say in terms of film analysis, I would say one of my favorite books was the cult film series by Danny Peary, who doesn't write about film anymore. He hasn't in almost 2 decades.
Is there any reason that he retired or quit?
I don't know. He was also a sports writer. And I think he just wanted to focus full-time on sports. And he's probably getting up there now, I think, at this
His
point.
book was great. I had the hardcover of the cult movies, and in fact, it introduced me to some films I never even heard of.
The Ultimate Film Fanatic is a great book, too. It was sort of like all the cult movies combined into one book and sort of an encyclopedic style.
Danny Peary introduced me to a very good movie called Deep End by Jerry Shomelsky, I believe. And sadly, it was not available until recently, but I finally got to see it, and I really enjoyed it. One book that I really liked, it was recommended to me. I had no interest at all in the subject, but a good friend of mine introduced me to it. And thank you, Chris. It was a book about a filmmaker by the name of Andy Milligan. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of him.
Yeah, the Ghastly Ones.
The Ghastly One, directed by...
Staten Island filmmaker.
Yeah, it was actually called, the book is called The Ghastly One. It was written by a man named Jimmy McDonald, who also wrote a book on Russ Meyer. And this guy is perhaps the worst filmmaker who's ever lived. He was this really gay, flamboyant director in the 60s who had like this crappy theater company, you know, the ones that just the people could not act. It's kind of like the ones you'd see in The Producers, you know, but real actors. And he'd make these films, and he was just a horrible human being. He'd edit, seriously, he'd edit films by ripping it with his teeth and taping it together and making these crappy movies. If you've ever seen one of his films, you want to blow your brains out. It's that bad. I had no interest in it, but my friend kept raving about it. Read the book. He goes, it's not just about him. It's about the whole filmmaking scene of that era. And let me tell you something. I bought it because it was in the bargain bin. I read that book I started at like 7 o'clock in the night, and the next thing I know, it was like in the morning came up. It was amazing. It's one of the best books I've ever read about film, because not only do you learn about a very sick person as a filmmaker. I mean, this guy was obviously a few cans short of a six-pack. But you learn about how the whole distribution and film scene of New York worked. That there was a very vibrant and thriving New York scene that would just make these films to play 42nd Street. And it was just amazing about how they would just throw these things together just to show and then to sell them, and how they sold these little nothing movies. And it's one of the most vivid portraits of a guy I've ever read in my life. I highly, 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 highly recommend it. It is out of print, but it is on Amazon used for a very inexpensive price.
Oh, okay. Okay, I have actually quite a list here, but I'll just start off with one that I guess I've read more recently, 2 years ago. It's called Pictures at a Revolution by Mark Harris, and it's basically tells a tale of a bunch of different 70s actors and movies like Sidney Poitier, Faye Dunaway, and it follows their careers, and it tells you all the behind-the-scenes stories on the films that kind of made them legendary or made their careers, like In the Heat of the Night, Bonnie and Clyde, great behind-the-scenes stories of Network and of the studios that were making them, and all the politics that were going on behind the scenes, which also kind of reminded me of like books like Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, or Rebels on the Backlot, how 6 Maverick directors and how they conquered the Hollywood studio system by Sharon Waxman. All these films, I mean, all these books really paint a vivid picture of like how the studios work and how these filmmakers actually manage to make all these films that we are in our collective memories. And, you know, it basically tells the story of how basically half the films that you view as classic and changed your life, the studio was totally against making them in the first place because they were too different. They were not exactly what the doctor ordered, and what all these directors, actors, producers, what they had to do to strive to make these films in the first place. And, you know, I can't recommend any of these books more than, because I just like reading reading books about movies, either production, script books that really tell you how the making of the film went or how they came up with the ideas, because I find them very inspiring, and I can sit there for hours and read one of those books, but whereas I read novels, but sometimes you can give me a novel and about after 10 minutes, I'm already ready to give up.
Well, I read Easy Rider's Raging Bull. That's a great book because it really teaches you about how the 60s, the film directors were basically these old dinosaurs that couldn't connect to today's audiences. So they went to these film schools, would get these guys, and would basically just give them complete creative carte blanche because they knew nothing about how to connect. And that's how you got some really interesting films. In fact, one thing I thought was very interesting, I found out how Universal had this experiment where they would give a director $1 million and he could do whatever he wanted with it. And they made these films. A few of them, one of them was really interesting, was called Silent Running. By I cannot believe I'm forgetting, Douglas Trumbull, who's actually a very great special effects artist. Another one was The Last Movie by Dennis Hopper, which the less said about that, the better. That was not a successful experiment.
Considered one of the worst movies ever made.
It's pretty bad. And another one was called Diary of a Mad Housewife by Frank Peary, who did the wonderful classic Mommy Dearest.
I was going to say is I really enjoy Easy Rider Raging Bull a lot too. The problem is Peter Biskin, who used to write for Rolling Stone, right, in Variety, or something else.
No Variety.
The only problem I have with, you have to be careful when you read that book.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of speculation in it
And
that he
gossip.
tries to present as truth. And it gets really gossipy, and it's really entertaining, folks. I mean, most of us who are film fans have pretty much heard of this book and read it.
It's like
it was also
National
turned into a documentary that they aired on HBO. Really entertaining one. But you have to keep in mind, there's stuff in there that is being presented as journalistic truth, and it's not really. It's really speculative.
Especially the stuff on Heaven's Gate.
Yeah, and there's lots of a Freak in there, you know, too, like with The Making a Sorcerer, which is not very. I'm reading Freakin's biography right now.
Great
So
book.
am I. So
read
am
it.
And there's stuff in there that's not consistent with what's in Biskin's book, but.
Yeah, that's why, speaking of that, for the Freakin' book is terrific. I read the book, and I was reading it, and I loved it because, you know what, Freakin's a guy who really doesn't mince words. He's pretty honest.
He doesn't bullshit.
He doesn't bullshit, and I kind of admire that. And that was one thing I was kind of curious about, is that there were two movies that he didn't even mention in his book. One was Deal of the Century, and the other one was Guardian. And Eric and I were lucky to see him at a Q&A, and I was going to ask him that, but someone else thankfully asked him already. He goes, "There's just some movies I don't want to discuss. It's not worth discussing."
So what's the point of talking about them if you don't like them?
I know, but I really would love to know the story about those two movies, because
Especially
to me,
Deal of the Century.
especially well, The Guardian's the one I'm interested in, because that movie is such an atrocious piece of garbage, you know.
There is a book I'd like to point out, and it's something that's been passed on to film student to film student. You know, those of us who went to took film theory and stuff like that. And it's a bit of a cliche to bring up, but it really is a good book. And it's the book on Hitchcock by Francois Truffaut, which is basically one long interview between him, which is very similar to The Conversations, actually, in the way it's structured. It's just the whole book is just a script. It's a transcription of Francois Truffaut interviewing Hitchcock, and it's fascinating.
Is this where he talked about the bomb under the table?
Yes, yeah. but again, it's a film lesson and a book. You learn more about that than you do reading some boring, book that tells you how to do lighting tricks and stuff like that.
Well,
I mean, it really.
No,
go ahead.
No, well, just like that book, I'm not saying this one is as good, but it also gives you a lot of insight into filmmaking and how a filmmaker thinks. Also, Conversations with a Wilder, but written by Cameron Crowe.
Yes, yes,
Which
that's a really good book too. I gotta
especially
say.
Considering Billy Wilder's like my #2 favorite director of all
I'm
time.
a huge Billy Wilder fan too.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say too, is what some of the kind of film books that don't get enough love, or like sort of the encyclopedic, film guides kind of books. But I'm a big fan of Psychotronic. Huge
Michael
fan.
Weldon?
Yeah, yeah. Like there was the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film, and then there was this sort of pseudo sequel, The Video Guide, which tried to cover all these films that he didn't cover in the first one. And having those two together they're a joy to rifle through and listen to his musings.
They're like it's like the Leonard Maltin guide, but
kind of, but it's a lot more fun. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a book that I had that was kind of like, of course, everyone I know, all of us film fans have had a copy of the Leonard Maltin guide in our possession at one time. The book that I had in my possession a lot was a book called Terror on Tape by James O'Neill. It was kind of like a Leonard Maltin guide of just horror movies, and he would rate them and tell you the tape. And it was I discovered a lot of interesting horror films that way. I love those little guides. They're good to have. But
Do you find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with him a lot?
You know what's so funny is that he would introduce me to a lot of films that I really ended up liking. And you know what? I actually did agree with most of his reviews. Most of them. Not everything, but most of them.
Well, it's interesting you're talking about reviewers because one of the books, well, she had many, but Pauline Kael's movie review books, I love reading. Even if you don't agree with her, it's interesting to see her perspective on these films.
Mean woman, God.
But
she was a good writer.
Yeah,
she was a good writer, and I found myself disagreeing with a lot of her stuff reading it now, looking back on the films that she was criticizing. But I I completely disagree with her whole thing about Citizen Kane, you know, which is legendary.
And also, she bashed like a lot of great movies. You know, like it's so funny. She said she hated The Exorcist, but she liked Exorcist 2.
Hey, Roger Ebert liked a lot of films that nobody else liked.
She walked out of Dawn of the Dead, by the way, so shame on her. But no, I think it's so funny. In Willow, they actually named the villain General Kael after her because she's a mean woman. She was a very known. She was a short lady who was very well known for having grudges against many people. Especially one of them was Robert Altman, who she used to be a big supporter of, and then he brought her into Hollywood, and of course, then it didn't work out.
So then she held it against him.
She held it against him forever until she showed pros. But she was a good writer. I will acknowledge that. Well, let's talk about the dirty books, the books that are really talk about the dark side.
Well, actually, before we get to the dirty books, I'd just like to mention one more guy since you were mentioning guys.
Okay, go ahead.
And it's a long title, so excuse me. Toms, Coons,
what?
Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks. An Interpretive History of Blacks in American Films by Donald Bogle. Now, I don't like Donald Bogle, but I will say that this book opened my eyes to a lot of African-American cinema. At the time, unfortunately, most of the reviews are of blaxploitation films, but also a lot of the films are early films made in the 1940s by like Oscar Mucho, and I guess you could call them kind of Chitlin circuit films, but it opened my eyes to that there was an underdog out of Hollywood black filmmaking circuit out there. And even though, again, I don't love his writing, but I have to say that a book opened up my eyes to a lot of African-American cinema, before you had your Melvin Van Peebles, before you had your Gordon Parks, and I really, appreciate
like Oscar Michaud?
Miss Oscar Michaud. I also read a book that was a biography of his life, so finding out from his own words what it was like making the films, that's a totally different book. That's Oscar Michaud, The Great and Only, The Life of America's First Black Filmmaker by Patrick Milligan. I just wanted to get those out before we move on because
those guides are very good because they introduce a lot of films.
You're talking about books that are just gossipy books?
Well, gossipy books, I'll give you a perfect example. There's a book that I actually just started reading recently, and let me tell you something. I was very happy to read this because it's a director that I absolutely despise. I think he's
Michael Bay?
No, I do despise him, but I haven't read that. I don't know if there's a book on him yet, but there probably is. The one I read was the book called The Man Who Hears Voices, the book about M. Night Shyamalan.
You actually read it, though?
I did read it because, let me tell you, that man is an egotistical jack-off. I could not believe this stuff. And
tell us what you really
Well, no, what's so funny is that, this is not, how they have those gossipy books? This is stuff that's actually confirmed because they have the interviews with some of the people that were involved that didn't give their names.
This is like right around the making of Lady in the Water, right?
Yes. This is what happens, is that he was convinced that he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So he actually had this script brought over to an executive, and it was her daughter's birthday or something, and he was pissed off because she hadn't read the script within the 2 hours that she got it. And he thought he was the biggest thing. And let me tell you, this is a guy who had like $300 million movies, no, $400 million movies in a row. He had Sixth Sense, he had The Unbreakable, Signs, and then he had The Village. And Disney,
was good in my view.
Disney read this script, and they were like, fuck you, we hate you so much, we're not even going to give you this movie because we don't want to deal with you anymore because they were so sick of his behavior. So they said goodbye, even though the man had $400 million movies in a row. And it went to Warner, and of course what happened? It tanked big time because his ego had finally gotten the best of him. In fact, you see that he actually cast himself in the movie, which I think was
which he constantly does.
Yeah, which he would show, And then of course he hasn't done anything memorable since that's even come close to hits that he had before.
Not memorable.
I don't know. The closest, I mean, like Easy Rider's Raging Bulls is dangerously close to that. Plus the sequel that focus on independent cinema.
Down and
Dirty Pictures.
Down
That
and
was the
Dirty
one I was
Pictures
recommending for bringing back.
is a bit. It's I'm not as. I think Easy Riders is a better book.
Down and Dirty Pictures, let's just mention, Down and Dirty Pictures is about Miramax specifically, about the
Well, it's about
Weinsteins
that, and it's
some
about
of the-
Sundance and Robert
and about
Redford.
how it worked. Miramax, of course, was a very big part of the independent film scene at one time, back in, at least in the 90s, and they had basically bought out Sundance and other things because, you know, they're just very nasty. Everyone knows the Weinsteins are not the nicest guys on earth, you know. In fact, I remember watching the Oscars when Nathan Lane was announcing the nomination thing for Best Anime Film, and he goes, Monsters, Inc. Isn't this a movie about the Weinsteins? And of course, they cut to Harvey in the audience not looking too happy.
Down and Dirty Pictures seems to be focused on, it wants to focus on the most negative aspects of their subjects' personality, of the book subjects' personalities. It wants to make Robert Redford look as bad as possible, the Weinsteins look as bad as possible. Maybe in real life it's justifiable, maybe they are, but it just seems to like be too impressed with how negative it wants to be about the whole thing.
Well, it talks about how like Robert Redford, you know, had this idea for Sundance, but of course the Sundance being named after his character from Butch Cassidy in The Sundance Kid, he had this idea, you know, because he was tired of making these Hollywood films, to start this Sundance Institute. And supposedly he had the idea back in the early '80s, and they were trying to do it, but he really couldn't get his shit together. So they had this other guy come in and basically started Sundance for him, and of course didn't get any credit. And was kind of like eased out because Robert Redford's kind of this passive-aggressive person, is how they portrayed him. I'm not saying I know this is true.
Yeah, and I know people who've worked with him, and there seems to be a consistent thing that there is a bit of a passive-aggressive thing going on there. But again, I just found myself a little irked and annoyed that that's where the writer was going with it. I would say that a book I read recently that is very gossipy, but so entertaining, Hellraisers by Robert Sellers,
yes,
which is
I've read
about
that.
the drunken British actors, you know, Peter O'Toole,
Oliver Reed?
Yes.
Oliver Reed, definitely. That's the most entertaining stuff, man.
Richard Harris.
Richard Harris, Sir Richard Burton. I mean, it is a really entertaining book.
Wouldn't you love to go? I mean, seriously, wouldn't you love to go and have a drink with those guys?
I don't think I could handle it. I think I would be
think you
dead within. Yeah, I mean, if you read it, if all that stuff, I don't know how much of it's true, but a lot of it is anecdotal, and it's just like there's no point to the book except each chapter is a drunken anecdote, an experience.
I would do anything to meet Oliver. I wish I could have met Oliver Reed, because let me tell you, that guy is a fucking.
He was insane.
He's crazy. I mean, I loved it. I saw this.
He was dangerously
He was
insane.
crazy. I mean, he has a scar on his neck from got into a bar
If
fight.
Keith Moon was afraid of him,
Yeah, but my favorite thing is like he goes, I got a tattoo of an eagle, and he goes, well, where is it? It's on my cock.
that impersonation is phenomenal.
No, oh God, don't, you better edit that
Phenomenal.
out.
Didn't they kind of also write a sequel which was like a few more modern, like Jack Nicholson?
That's what I hear. They did one with the Americans, so I heard it's not as.
Well,
No,
they're
it's
not as
not.
interesting.
I mean, come on. You know, the stories about Omar Sharif and Peter O'Toole being drunk while they're shooting that scene, like the stampede on the, you know, riding the camels going downhill, going into battle, you know, and this like big like military thing.
Well, I like that book
Because that's the only way they could stomach doing that scene.
Well, it informed me a lot about Richard Harris's career, because I knew next to nothing about his career other than he was in Unforgiven before reading this book. So I am thankful for that book, for at least introducing me to his filmography.
Well, he's a terrific actor. It's a shame too that alcohol really destroyed his momentum. But he made a great. Well, he started off with an amazing film, by the way, The Sporting Life.
yes, I've never seen that one.
Amazing film. Check it out.
But you know, I love any story.
I was going to say, there's a recent book, I think you read it, right? I recommend it, Tales from
I was about to
Development
mention
Hell.
that. I was about to. Yes, Eric recommended a book.
Doug Harris?
It's on. You should be on your iPhone.
I got it, yeah, I have it.
I'll introduce it.
Sorry,
as
folks.
As you know, there's many films.
David Hughes.
All right.
I read that one
There's
also.
There's many books. There's many films that are in development for years that never get made. Eric recommended a book called Tales from Development Hell by,
David Hughes.
and it talks about a lot of films that were in development for many years and never got made. I believe Superman, one of them with
Yeah,
Tim
Superman
Burton.
Lives.
Yeah, which, oh my God, that took 10 years and millions of dollars but never got made. There's also some interesting stuff about some scripts that got optioned, like The Hot Zone. Most people don't remember this, but back in the mid-'90s, that's one of the most
Came out around the
interesting
same time as Outbreak, and
Yeah,
Outbreak was the winner.
Well, actually, the
of
thing
that
that this was so
competition.
funny is that This book, The
Or
Hot
not came out at the same time. It was developed around the same
Well,
time.
The Hot Zone was an actual book based on an article, and it was a super hot article. I mean, they were like...
It was a best-selling book.
Yeah, and they fast-tracked it. It was going to star Robert Redford and Jodie Foster. It was all set to go, and then one of the producers that tried to bid for it, who didn't get it, I believe was Arnold Kopelson, who developed his own script later called Outbreak, which got made into a terrible movie with Dustin Hoffman. But it's so funny is this Hot Zone would sound like a really good story. It really sounded good, but the problem is that the cast could not agree on this. You know, the billing and Robert felt he wasn't getting enough, and Jodie Foster thought she wasn't getting enough, and there was all these things. But it just shows how this very big project, which they think is an instant success, just bottoms out, and then the cash-in actually beats them. It's a very interesting story.
Well, one of the reasons I like this book was because I had previously read 50 Greatest Movies Never Made by Chris Gore. And while that's a good book, this one at least went more into detail about what the films were, what the studios didn't exactly like about them, instead of just telling you a general overview like, oh, this is what it was about. Who knows why it didn't get made.
It's like each book, by the way, the book has a chapter on like each movie that didn't get made. It's really interesting. It's like a really in-depth story. Sometimes they have interviews with the people.
They focus on a specific project. I mean, for example, they go into detail, and we probably culled our trivia from this in our previous shows, but the whole, Total Recall thing.
Total Recall.
How it was originally developed for Cronenberg, and they get into all of that.
And then how the sequel to Total Recall became Minority Report, or my favorite one, the one I would have done anything to see, which would be The Crusades with Arnold Schwarzenegger, directed by Paul Verhoeven.
With John Turturro and Jennifer Connelly.
Yeah, it's amazing too because there's all these movies that you really wish got made, but just somehow they couldn't get it together.
They also have one that's like the greatest sci-fi movies never made, but it's not written by the same guy. But one book I'd like to just mention, it's not as good as any of these. This goes back more into the gossipy, but you can't put it down. High Concept, Don Simpson and Hollywood Culture of Excess.
Oh, God.
Oh, my God. It doesn't delve into that much filmmaking, but it talks about his exploits, not only in life, his upbringing, but also all the infamous behind-the-scenes stories you've ever heard about when he was producing films with Jerry Bruckheimer. That it surprised me that Jerry Bruckheimer stayed with him as a producing partner for so long, because just the things he would demand, like he wanted a supporting role in Days of Thunder, which thankfully got cut down majorly before the film got released.
Let's just remind who he is. Him and his partner, Jerry Bruckheimer, produced a lot of films like Flashdance, Top Gun, Days of Thunder. The Rock, I believe, was his last film before he died. Don Simpson was this very colorful guy who was just a pathological liar. He would make up his whole past. He was a son of an Eskimo, was one story. He had plastic surgery. He lived life to excess. This guy was absolutely insane. But you know what? He had a very good... he could really make a hit. Everything he touched turned to gold, at least for a while anyway.
Tracker, even though towards the end, obviously their partnership was dissolving because his excess was getting too much that people were refusing to work with him anymore.
Mm-hmm. But he was a fascinating character. I will say he was one of the I guess you could say he would definitely have his own show.
He was one of the caricatures of the Hollywood producer.
Yeah, he was.
Him and Robert Evans, I guess.
Actually, Robert Evans wrote a very good book.
Kid Stays in a Picture, which is a good book, and it was turned into a good documentary, actually. It's a very good book.
Yeah, and Robert Evans, one of the most fascinating stories in the whole movie is about how the script for Chinatown, how it won Best Screenplay, and they talk about how he didn't understand what the fuck the script was about. He goes, I don't get this, but you know what, we're just going to go with it. And they made a huge hit out of it. And my favorite story in the whole book, which is fascinating, I mean, highly recommend it just for this, the story about the Cotton Club.
Oh, yes. That's the most epic story.
Wow. That deserves a documentary of its own.
And even though I'm not a big fan of audiobooks, definitely get the audiobook if you can of the book.
It reminds me, the book about Bonfire of the Vanities.
Oh, yes.
Devil's Candy?
Yes, read that also.
Awesome. Awesome book. I almost forgot about that book. That book is awesome.
It's funny is that there's so many movies. I mean, that is a fascinating story.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Because I remember my friends who all read the original book, when they heard that Tom Hanks was there, like, Tom Hanks? This is like no way. Today it's probably easier to see that because now he's established himself as a dramatic actor.
And he's one of the few people who actually comes off decent in the whole book.
Yeah, it's a pretty bad movie, and it's sad because it has everything in it should work. You have Brian De Palma, you have a really good cast, you have a good screenwriter, you have everything, all the money, but you still don't have a good movie.
But I will note, I didn't read the book. That is one of my guilty pleasure movies. I really like it.
I do love the guy who plays the judge.
I want to give a shout out to a
Morgan Freeman?
No, sorry, no, the Black reference, the Al Sharpton-like
I know
character.
who you're talking.
That guy's great.
There is a book I want to bring up that's not specifically a film book, but I think it's seminal for anyone who's a horror film fan. And it's a series of essays written by Stephen King called Dance Macabre.
That's a great
And
book.
I think it's still in print.
It is in print. It was written in 1982. It was a book on horror culture and movies that have influenced Stephen King. It was basically just a whole bunch of essays.
Right.
And what's interesting is that he would talk about films that he really liked. One that I remember he loved, and I absolutely adored it, was a movie called Tourist Trap, which he was raving about. And what I really admired about Stephen King's book, that one especially, is that he would champion the things that he really loved. And that's why I have a lot of respect for him. King, I mean, I read a lot of his books, I mean, because he is a great writer, but what I like about him is that whenever he sees something he loves, he really endorses it. He tells people to go seek it out, you know? I mean, Evil Dead owes him a very big round of thanks because he's the one who basically gave it a great quote, which everyone went to check out because he was the biggest writer since Charles Dickens at one time, you know? But yeah, it's a great book. It is still in print.
What do you think of the Joe Bob Briggs books? I mean, because I still have to return the one you lent me. Was it 50 most disturbing movies that you lent me?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's okay. I still have.
They're all right.
Movies.
They're like coffee table books. You can flip through them, and
I love Joe Bob Briggs. He's another champion.
he's a fun personality.
Yes.
Yeah.
He really is.
John Bloom, also known as, and as of course I know who really loves him here is you love him in Casino, I know.
I love everything in Casino,
That's my
but
favorite
yes,
person.
him.
Yeah.
A book, also, since we're talking about horror, that a lot of viewers might want to check out if they're really into horrors or trying to up their ante in the horror field, they might want to check out a book that's put out by Rumor called The 200 Greatest Horror Films You've Never Seen. And you can get it exclusively through their website. But I read it, and I found that I had seen, I would say 75% of the films, but there are a lot of great suggestions in there in case you, because the films they pick are less mainstream, less the Paranormal Activity or the Halloween movies, more the foreign like The Host or Let the Right One In. And also classic horror films, which I'll admit I have to bone up on, but you know, like one of them is Eyes Without a Face, which I only saw recently.
That's a very good movie.
It's fantastic. It really
which
is.
is like now becoming, it's on my list of one of my favorite horror films of all time, but that book introduced me to that film, for instance.
Well, we got to wrap this up, gentlemen, but I'm Edwin Samuelson. This was the CineFiles. We hope you enjoyed these recommendations. I hope you'll check out everyone's recommendation. The book I would most highly recommend is The Ghastly One. If you love film, it's a book for you. What about you? What's one? If you had one book to recommend, what would it be?
I would say start with Easy Riders and Raging Bulls.
Conversations for film, learning how to make film, approach film storytelling. And I would say if you can get your hands on anything by Danny Peary.
Yeah,
Yes,
great writer.
I agree.
Great writer. Well, anyway, I'm Edwin Samuelson. This was the CineFiles, and thanks for tuning in.